Hi, this is Jeff Nyquist with another edition of Friends and Enemies. My co-host Alex Benesch is with me. He's from Germany. I'm in the United States. And we've had a big week. Trump was inaugurated president, 47th president of the United States. He had a very inspiring speech from the American point of view. But we have an uproar in Canada because of his talks of annexing Canada. We have Denmark not happy with Trump. And of course, we have the whole Ukraine war situation, which we've had some. I've been doing some digging and found out some things about how that's actually going. I've got two sources that say in 120 days the fighting in Ukraine will stop. So it could be as early as 90 days. But anyway, Alex, so what have you got this week on the inauguration of the American president?
Well, every time there's a Republican president, incoming Republican administration, there's always this debate popping up about continuity of government, the Insurrection Act, and anything that was created during the Reagan era, the MainCore database, some of the older things. This always pops up, and the debate in public is never really fair. It's never really professional, and I think some people truly misunderstand what continuity of government is and what the Insurrection Act is, what it was made for. And so, during the election campaign, this also became an issue. The entire pitch of the Democrats was basically, you gotta vote Democrat, otherwise you're gonna get this dictatorship. It's gonna be this doomsday scenario of a right-wing Republican dictatorship, which has never happened before. You know, with Reagan it didn't happen, Bush Sr. didn't happen, Bush Jr. didn't happen, so a couple of more Republican administrations, it never happens, but they always they always go back to that point. You have to accept any terrible Democrat policy, live with it, deal with it, because the alternative would be this right-wing dictatorship. And now with the Ukraine situation, everything else that's been going on, the Chinese, all these Chinese people running around in America, and that situation, there's always the danger of an artificial uprising, and that could involve illegal migrants. This was a calculation that goes back a long time, especially during the Reagan era. So you would have communist networks, communist agents setting things on fire and just encouraging people to riot for one reason or the other. You know, this was anticipated, especially I think during the Reagan era, because they were considering the option of, let's say, sending 20,000 Marines to Nicaragua and places of that nature to prevent a communist takeover. And in case that ever happened, the calculation was that Moscow would retaliate by activating their communist networks in America and staging these uprisings. And this would have been led by a couple of thousand specific assets in America. And attached to that would be leftists, would be many illegal migrants, refugees, especially communist refugees from these places like Nicaragua. When an operation goes down, when these communists leave the country and go to America and just start a riot. Okay, so this is a calculation that is as important today as it was back then. So recently, this was maybe a week ago, Politico was reporting, according to nearly a dozen retired officers and active military lawyers, as well as academics who teach at West Point and Annapolis, there's an intense internal debate within the U.S. military community about what orders it would have to follow if President Donald Trump deployed the military domestically. The last time an American president deployed the U.S. military under the Insurrection Act, during the 1992 Los Angeles riots, federal troops were kept away from the front lines. Now, I don't remember these riots because back then I was, I was 8 years old? You remember them? What
Oh
happened
yeah,
with them?
I owned a security company in Southern California, and but not within the area of the riots, but just south of them. We were initially concerned how far this thing would spread. They were burning things. The police lost control. The governor had to call for troops. It was we had Governor Wilson then, and it was really scary. A friend of mine, my business partner, had friends from I think Australia, from overseas, who were visiting, and they kind of wanted to take a look at LA to see how it was going. So I think they drove around there just as the thing was being settled down. But yeah, what happened in that time was the Rodney King beating. Rodney King, the Simi Valley police had caught him. He was high on, was it PCP, something like that, and he would not be subdued. It took, I think, 3 or 4 police officers. Well, they put them on trial for trying to subdue him. Now, if you do not obey a police officer, if you resist him, they can use force on you until you stop resisting. Well, in this case, he wasn't feeling no pain because of the drugs he was on. They claim they overused force and that they did it because he was black, that it was a racial crime. And the Simi Valley jury found the defending police officers, I forget if there were 3 or there were 4 of them, found them innocent. Well, that kicked off massive violent riotings in LA, riots in LA. Huge destruction, people being beaten, stores being broken into and looted. It was a complete lawlessness. And the result was, and this is really shameful for the United States, we have laws against double jeopardy. These men were already tried and found innocent. They decided to try them on federal civil rights charges, found them guilty and put them in prison because of a riot.
Yeah.
The rioters got what they wanted. That's very funny. Not only did they get all the TV sets and all the things they stole from the stores they broke into, but they got to put the 4 police officers in prison. And famously, Rodney King, publicly, Saint Rodney King made the statement, why can't we all just get along? He was probably dumbfounded as a drug using, gender fluid guy, all this violence surrounding him. I mean, I don't know how many arrests he had, but he was not what you would call a law-abiding a citizen. But they made it into a race thing. They definitely made it into a race thing. And of course, then you had in LA the other race-based trial in the 90s, of course, O.J. Simpson trial, which O.J. Simpson was a black celebrity. I mean, one of the most famous football players in American sports. And they found him innocent of murdering his wife. And I think just about everybody that saw the evidence agrees he was guilty. He was very guilty. And but he got off because he was black and because people were LA was so afraid of riots. And everybody was so afraid of being thought racist if they convicted him because he was black. So it was a great conundrum. We are not a colorblind society in the United States. White people especially, are so afraid of being called racist. They are afraid to say what they actually think about a particular criminal or crime. And this has gone to a breakdown throughout the country of law and order to some extent. We then had the riots again in 2020 in the summer over a police killing of another black serial criminal, and of course they wanted to put the policemen in jail. And the country went through it again. Only this time, the rioting and the communists were organizing the rioting. We'd had also this thing happening in the St. Louis area in Missouri. In the in-between, the communists were good at organizing black people, saying that, whenever a black criminal dies in the custody of the police, it's a crime of white police officers. And of course, you had crowds of white people being intimidated into getting on their knees in front of rioting blacks in the United States.
Yeah, but the game, I mean, the game works the same even when it's just white people. I mean, we had this very famous case during the Cold War. This was, I think it was the killing of a student whose name I think was Benno ohne Sorg. I don't think Americans are much familiar with the case, but it created a huge firestorm over here. So this young guy gets killed during a demonstration of some sort, and he was killed by a police officer who was thought to be very right wing. But and of course the communist networks turned this into a huge deal. And they try to get as much out of it as they could, but years later it turned out that this right-wing police officer had interesting connections to the East German Stasi, and so you can wait until a case happens and then capitalize on it and then just make everybody go crazy, or you maybe fandangle things, so you create a case, and I mean we talked about. In a previous episode during the election cycle, we talked about Kamala Harris and her communist parents and the influences on them, the books that were written by these black communists, and they have this whole program set out, and they have this whole liberation cult ready, and it's a huge deal, and you can literally create a case out of thin air. And for those kind of cases, there's a tool set. There's the Insurrection Act. There was the MainCore database and those sort of things. And now there's in this Politico piece, there are quotes from different people. There's a quote from Graham Parsons, philosophy professor at West Point. In a New York Times editorial in September, he urged military officers and soldiers to resist politicized orders. Really? And some lawyers, it says here, some lawyers and military law experts say there's widespread confusion even among active duty officers about how the military should behave, especially when Trump invokes the Insurrection Act and calls in troops. In most cases, officers and troops have no choice but to follow such presidential orders, even if they have ethical issues with doing so. If they refuse, they may face a court-martial, and on and on and on. So,
By the way, this is very serious because you have communists and anarchists, but mainly the communist organizations, like on the West Coast, the Revolutionary Communist Party, which is a Maoist, it's Chinese Communist Party. And the Black Lives Matter, by the way, the organizers of that admitted that they were Chinese communist trained. You have foreign communist group, trained people organizing riots in the United States, and you've got the left in general in the bureaucracy saying, oh, if the president tries to use troops to contain these riots, he's the one that's acting illegally. So this is real subversion in real time that we're talking about.
And I mean, the
standards. And this is the problem with allowing, and by the way, it all comes from our education system. It comes from colleges, universities that are teaching critical race theory, which, by the way, the Pentagon has made critical race theory education mandatory throughout the military during the Biden administration. And this demoralizes both blacks and whites because it says that all whites are racist and that blacks are serving a racist country when they're in the military. So why would a black want to serve a white racist country by being in its military? And why would a white want to serve a country that's telling him he's basically has the mentality of a Nazi or a Southern slaveholder in the antebellum South? I mean, it's really quite destructive of the morale. And people who point it out, they're just attacked. Trump is in his inaugural address says he wants a colorblind society. He won a lot of minority votes. I think he got a majority of the Hispanic vote. Well, maybe not, but I'd have to think. He got a very significant amount of the Hispanic vote. He got an increase in the black vote. And I think the thing is that the communists know that we're a multiracial society, so dividing us by race is an important strategy of the communists. And of course, turning every single racial group against the white majority, which is not really a majority in places like California, for example, but turning them against them is a powerful tool. And they have gotten, and people are so stupid, they are so easily swayed by illusions that this Russian, Soviet, Chinese line of approach of divide and conquer has been incredibly powerful here.
Yeah.
And so many people, especially on the far left, believe it. And then you have the reaction on the right. We have right wingers who say far right wingers who say, "Oh, you say I'm a racist? Well, I might as well be one, so I am one."
Mm, mm.
That's what you see on the right. So then they feed each other
Yeah. Yeah.
in this
Exactly.
vicious circle.
And of course, when you have actual communist moles of communist assets in the Democratic Party, these assets, they know the FBI inside out, because every couple of years the Democrats, they have significant control over the FBI and other agencies, so they know where the FBI is not as strong or temporarily not as strong, what the limitations are, how difficult it is to develop a case. So by knowing the system inside out, these communist assets, they can then feed this information, updated information, feed that to their contacts, so they can then coach and recoach these assets on the ground that are embedded in the universities and NGOs and whatnot. So they can always tell them, well, you got to watch out for this because the FBI is looking for this. Or, if you do it like this, you can evade the FBI, or you can just lower the risk. It's like, if you know the plan of a building, if you know the schematics, you can find your way around, even though you've never physically been there before. And I think it's the same with subverting law enforcement that way. And so, of course, then foreign networks or foreign controlled networks, they can create a situation in the United States when the normal police can't handle the situation. And that's why these things exist, like the Insurrection Act and continuity of government. And of course, Russia, China, they're anticipating this reaction, so they have already a narrative prepared and say, well, this is tyranny, this is the New World Order, or this is the fascist dictatorship, because they actually try to save the U.S. They actually try to regain order, and they use the military sporadically to reestablish order. So there's always the attempt to frame it. So whatever the U.S. government does, it's always presented as bad. It's always presented in a certain way, so that these indoctrinated people, the left, the truthers and others, black people, whatever, so they feel vindicated. They feel that, yeah, this is exactly what we've been warning about for so long. Let's just double down and go even more crazy. Now it says here, this is another quote in the Political piece. The basic reality is that the Insurrection Act gives the president dangerously wide discretion to use the military as a domestic police force, says Joseph Nunn, an expert at the Brennan Center for Justice. It's an extraordinarily broad law that doesn't provide any meaningful criteria for when it's appropriate for the president to use the military domestically. Again, the question, I mean, why hasn't this Republican dictatorship happened? Why didn't it happen yet? Why hasn't it happened yet? Didn't happen during Bush Jr., didn't happen during Bush Sr., didn't happen during Reagan. It never happens. It never happens. It's like a mechanism. And then they say this, nowhere in the text of the Insurrection Act does it say that the president must cite insurrection, rebellion, or anything similar as a justification for a deployment. The wording is so vague that Trump could, and any other president, by the way, even a Democrat, could potentially only claim he sees a conspiracy. Well, the Insurrection Act is
Well,
the main...
look at the Democrats. The Democrats, I have to inject, the Democrats saw conspiracy and insurrection on January 6, 2021. And of course, there wasn't a conspiracy. They arrested a bunch of people from a crowd, and there were a handful of violent people. people on the right say they were agent provocateurs who provoked the whole thing. And there were a handful of loonies who broke in, and then people who just, not too very smart people who just wandered in because the door was open to the Capitol building, and they said, "Oh, this is an insurrection." It was a riot. You could go and you could
Yeah.
call a riot an insurrection. You could call a somebody creating a disturbance an insurrection. It's an exaggeration. And this is the problem. And of course, Trump pardoned them. And of course, we've gotten in the other thing in this is that you've got President Biden, using the pardon power of the president to preemptively pardon his whole family.
Yeah.
Now, I don't understand how this works, because my understanding, and maybe the Supreme Court will clarify, but you can pardon somebody of something of a crime that they haven't been accused of yet.
It's a
That is a
perpetual
blanket
get out
pardon.
of jail free card.
Yeah, that basically, up until the moment of the pardon, everything I did that was illegal before that pardon, I get off scot-free.
Purge.
And I'm an associate of you, I'm a relative of you, or a business partner of you, or somebody that maybe was involved with you. I mean, this now we're getting into the thing where the integrity of the office of the president is completely breached. Biden has no integrity to to pardon his family like that. And of course, Trump was prosecuted. The other side of the coin is he was prosecuted. They tried to put him in jail for a crime that wasn't a crime. Basically, he was supposedly misused. Had investment funds and had not done something technically proper in the paperwork, and it was standard practice what his lawyers did, what his business did, and he repaid the loan.
Yeah.
Right? He repaid the investors. Where was the? How could you be prosecuted for a crime when there was no victim? Nobody was injured. All the legal procedures, according to the way it's actually done, were followed, but they created through a technicality, what is it, 36 felonies, whatever it was, to try to put him in jail. I mean, every reasonable lawyer looked at this and said, "This is a political prosecution." So at the same time, the Democrats pardon real crimes, the Hunter Biden laptop, the taking of bribes from a foreign enemy power, a serious crime. He pardons that, and the previous president is almost put in jail on a technicality, on a bogus charge, right?
Yeah. And also, of course,
This is crazy, because we're headed towards the Soviet Union on this. If this, and Trump promised he was going to fix this. I don't know how he can, because we have law schools, putting out more lawyers educated in a kind of pseudo-Marxism, Marxist view, critical race theory, critical theory as applied to law. We have more of them, and they're becoming judges. And the weight of this cultural change, this march through the institutions, it's a giant shadow that's coming over us and darkening everything. And so how can Trump change that?
Yeah.
The fact that
And
all these people are being right now educated and produced in our
and this
institutions.
march, by the
I
way,
don't know.
just so people understand this march through the institutions, it may seem at an early stage like a linear development. It's like and then it starts ramping up. At some point, it becomes exponential. At some point, the speed becomes really incredible, and that's why. We have to take this so seriously. And it says here the Insurrection Act was also used by President Dwight Eisenhower after the Supreme Court's decision in Brown versus Board of Education in 1954, when he deployed the 101st Airborne Division to help desegregate the South. George Washington and John Adams used the Insurrection Act in response to early rebellions against federal authority. Abraham Lincoln invoked it at the start of the Civil War, and President Ulysses Grant used it to stop the Ku Klux Klan in the 1870s. So, I mean, compare this to other countries, right? Other countries who were in crisis, and how these other countries reacted. What these other countries then did and created that lasted quite a while and was so super horrible. Compare this to the Germans.
You know what
Compare this to the French.
Romans did? You know what the Romans did when a city started to riot? They would take the legions, surround the city, and they would walk through the city killing everything.
Yeah.
Killing everybody, and they would just depopulate the city and bring in new people. They didn't mess around. They weren't going to accept it. And the thing is that in the United States, of course, we're not brutal like the Roman Empire. We're the other we're the other way. We're allowing this disorder, but it's cultural. This wave, this changing of all our legal concepts, the eradication of, you look at Blackstone's legal, Blackstone's legal book there on law, and what the standard of practice in English common law and American law has been for hundreds of years. Gave us a quite an interesting system of justice here, where people really could rely to a great extent, but it's become so crazy now that you really can't. And this march through the institutions, it is so insane now that no single president can change the culture. The only reason, by the way, that we are not a communist state now, the only reason why it hasn't happened, why the Russians and Chinese haven't overwhelmed us, is the fact that with this kind of politically correct wave, this culture thing, they've swept away right and wrong. So that all of these pseudo-Marxist politicians, all of these lefties and the people on the right, as well, because the general moral climate has declined so much, that there is so much corruption in the United States in the political system that and that this corruption cannot be controlled even by the communists who helped to foster it. So that when you have someone as corrupt and vile as Bill Clinton as president, when he is sat down by Boris Yeltsin, and he is making excuses in his last face-to-face meeting with Boris Yeltsin in Istanbul in December 1999. And Boris Yeltsin says, Bill, I still believe in you. But I need one thing from you. Give Europe to Russia. And Bill Clinton, who likes his neck, who doesn't want to then tip over the whole world balance of power and just hand Europe over to Russia. And he really doesn't see how he can do that, because Europe, the corrupt people in Europe who Moscow controls, won't give up Europe to Russia either. That they all realize, in some sense, their own bodyguards will shoot them in the head. Just like what happened to Yanukovych in Ukraine. Basically, if we understand what happened there, is Putin wanted Yanukovych to stand up and invite the Russian troops in to restore order in Ukraine. And his bodyguard said, we're not going to protect you if you do that. So he fled. And so this is the problem. The corrupt people are not socialist idealists. They started out in their youth as idealists, but they were really, there was a deep corruption in them to begin with, that they became communists. Their idealism was a kind of mental disorder. And when they saw the money and they saw the power, and they just got corrupted by it. And so when the Moscow and Beijing calls for them, all right, now run the white flag up. You're in power now. You can do it. You can surrender Asia. You could surrender the Pacific. You could surrender Europe. And they go, holy crap. Yeah, that's what I was supposed to do, but I can't. And this is the great frustration of Moscow and Beijing, that they can't just use corruption and infiltration, right, and they can't use the march through the institutions to take everything over, because at the top of that great march through the institutions are completely rotten human beings who are not going to be loyal to anything. They're just completely selfish.
Yeah.
And this is why the Soviet and the Chinese systems didn't work and can't produce militaries that can win wars easily.
Now, during the Reagan years, security experts expected that a U.S. intervention in Latin America, for example, the deployment of 20,000 Marines against a new Che Guevara or a new Fidel Castro, could trigger left-wing uprisings in the U.S., including uprisings of illegal migrants, especially illegal migrant sort of refugees, communist refugees from these countries where an intervention happened. So it is perfectly clear that Moscow would have deliberately tried to stir up sentiment for such uprisings. And the White House and the Pentagon drew up lists of domestic enemies, lists like databases like MainCore, and conducted exercises such as Rex 84. Now, if you read actually into what is known about these things, this was specifically designed for such cases. There was also continuity of government stuff where the expectation was the United States gets hit by one or more nuclear missiles, and then chaos would break out because these agent networks, these people would set up uprisings or mini revolutions. And so there needs to be continuity of government, order has to be restored, and that includes domestic use of the military. Now, that case never really happened that way, but these false perceptions and false ideas were then cultivated not just by the left, but also were cultivated by traditional conspiracy activists. Now, for example, the Oklahoma City bomber Timothy McVeigh and others believed that this whole continuity of government thing, Insurrection Act, domestic use of the military, that was just a smokescreen to bring in the New World Order. And that would happen really, really soon. So these activists, they had to do something drastic, like a bombing of a federal building to get this attention. And also, we talked about this in a previous episode, this famous novel, The Turner Diaries, that was very popular with the extreme right wing. It's a lunatic story about terrorism and countermeasures, and then more terrorism, and it just creates the civil war. And at the end, these extreme right-wing people would win and then have the control.
Basically, anti-Semitic Nazis, right?
Yeah, basically, that's basically it. So people were some people were unaware of Rex 84, MainCore, this and that. Some people were oblivious to it, and some people, they wanted to find out about it, but the information that they found was either left-wing or it was the truthers, the conspiracy activists. And so when 9/11 happened, this whole thing became a big topic again, because more databases, more technological advancements when it comes to electronic intelligence gathering, and we mentioned this on the show before. These famous or infamous communist moles, the famous cases like Robert Hanssen and others, they did great damage to the American intelligence community at a very specific time, and then the FBI and others, they were not quite able to detect these Muslim terrorists that had just come over. They just came over from Germany to the U.S. to do 9/11, and while they were still living in Germany, they were in the city of Hamburg, which is very left wing, and there were like 20 to 30 Islamists from this network listing the same address, the same apartment as their home. One listening device, one significant intercept, one asset in that apartment. One thing could have prevented 9/11, but the left-wing government, the left-wing city government in Hamburg at the time, they claimed to not have noticed these Muslim terrorists running around and getting ready to move to America. And the guy responsible for the city, especially the safety of the city, the guy responsible at the time was Olaf Scholz, who is still our chancellor today. So these things happen, 9/11, and then there's a response, and then the left and the truthers, they completely demonize any sort of response. Now, of course, there was crazy stuff going on during the Bush years, granted, but if we look at one of these things, this was in 2008, right? So this is right the end of the George W. Bush administration. In 2008, the MainCore database became public. This was a report by Christopher Ketchum and one by Tim Shorrock. So they say that the NSA, FBI, CIA, other agencies, they feed information into this database, and it's quite a large database. It's an emergency internal security database system designed for use by the military in the event of a national catastrophe, suspension of the Constitution, or the imposition of martial law. Yeah, in case a nuclear missile, or more nuclear missiles hit the U.S. or these uprisings happen, that's what it was for. And one of these journalists interviewed Norman Bailey, private financial consultant with years of government intelligence experience dating from the George W. Bush admin back to the Reagan administration. According to Bailey, who from 2006 to 2007 headed a special unit within the Office of the Director of National Intelligence, focused on financial intelligence on Cuba and Venezuela. Oh, there you go. The NSA has been using its vast powers with signals intelligence to track financial transactions around the world since the early 1980s. Oh, let me guess why it was important to spy on Cuba and Venezuela, because these were staging areas to do operations in the U.S., right?
Oh yeah, of course. There, there's with all the pushing of 10, 11 million illegal aliens into the U.S. during the Biden administration, this was organized by cartels and networks and criminal groups that were basically under the direction of the Chinese and Russians. And I go to General Alora Richardson, the commander of Southern Command, her statements about China and Russia taking over Latin America, taking over our backyard, moving into it. By the way, something she said like 3 years ago, which nobody in the government reacted to. Nobody in Congress said anything. Nobody in the administration said, oh, we need to do something about this. Just let it slide, And so, of course, Venezuela and Cuba are key. I mean, Venezuela is a communist state. It's part of the communist bloc. Cuba is part of the communist bloc. Brazil is being integrated into the communist bloc. The Sao Paulo Forum, founded by Lula da Silva and Fidel Castro, tried to unite all leftist parties in South America into a common cause to elect presidents. And all these countries, and most of the countries in Latin America, have presidents from left-wing parties now, and in Central America. And they are drawing the entire region, Central America and South America, into the orbit of Russia and China, with the Chinese coming in, building infrastructure, bringing in large numbers of Chinese. This is true in Mexico as well. And they can empty their jails. They can send people who are having problems that they can't take care of. They can send them to America by the millions, flooding our cities, flooding our society with this. And of course, we're racist if we don't open our border and let them flood in. There is no country in the world that could survive invasions of tens of millions of people from foreign places. That's an invasion. That's a takeover.
Yeah.
Every country regulates its border and says only so many immigrants, only so many people can come in, and say, well, we want doctors and we want scientists and we want this. Of course, because every country is looking for its own interest. We don't want to take in all these indigent people that suddenly our welfare state and the local hospitals and the local communities no longer have the money that they can't take care of their own citizens.
Yeah.
So this is what they've done, and it's an active strategy. It's part of the Cloward-Piven strategy, which was a couple of communists who said we can cause the American system to collapse by overwhelming the welfare state and collapsing the economy, collapsing the causing deficit spending to go so high that everything just falls down. It's an actual conscious strategy, believe it or not. And of course, the Russians and Chinese are feeding it from the outside through their cartels, and drug trafficking is part of it, organized crime, money laundering, and of course, corrupting our officials at every level, in counterintelligence, at the police, in the DEA, everywhere. And if people think Afghanistan, where the Russian mafia was heavily engaged in opium trafficking, was not a major staging ground for corrupting U.S. military officials and intelligence officials, you got another thing coming. We don't even know the stories here. The communists operate on all these levels. Yeah. The underworld, the criminal underworld, the financial world, the economic trading system, and of course in the political world, in the world of narratives, right-wing
Yeah.
and left-wing narratives.
I've been to Panama years ago. Actually, this was 2009. So we were, me and my wife, we were in Panama. We were in Costa Rica, and you see Chinese structures everywhere. The big
Yeah.
malls, shipping, just everything. China, 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 China. And didn't Trump recently say something about the Panama Canal and how
Well, in his
important he thinks it is?
inaugural speech, look, in his inaugural speech, Trump said, "We're taking the canal back. We did not give the canal to Panama for Panama to give it to China because at both ends of the canal, the ports of entry and exit are operated by China."
Yep.
And so this is a problem. And in fact, when Trump said that in his inaugural address that we're taking the canal back, guess who said, "No, no, you're not. We're going to stop you"? Vladimir Putin, the Kremlin, said they're going to stop us. So this shows you that the Chinese operating the canal is something the Russians want. It's part of their deal. They need to control this hemisphere, and the canal is a strategic object in controlling the hemisphere. This just gives the game away. And, for those who don't know the history of Panama, you know that the United States created the country of Panama. Did you know that?
Yeah. Yeah.
President Teddy Roosevelt, Theodore Roosevelt, basically, there was a rebellion in northern Colombia, right? And it was part of Colombia, and it broke away, and we supported it so we could create the canal there. So we supported this state. It became a kind of client state of the United States, and we built the Panama Canal there.
Yeah.
So that is what we did. And of course, with the Monroe Doctrine, the United States is a colossal power, but in the Western Hemisphere, we always had this thing that, wait a minute, we're not going to let anybody, we do not want to be threatened from Europe or Asia. We're not going to let any other power establish colonies here that are bases to attack us. So the Monroe Doctrine, which was created by Secretary of State John Quincy Adams under the Monroe administration, President James Monroe, and this administration existed 200 years ago, said that that we are not, we are not going to allow these powers to be established. And of course, how could we do that? We were relying on the British Navy to keep them out, because we had a kind of after the War of 1812, we had a kind of understanding with the British Empire. A lot of people don't realize. Then the War of 1812, which is a war between Great Britain and Canada on the one side and the U.S. on the other, that when that war was concluded, a part of the peace was to establish the longest demilitarized border in the world. And the longest standing demilitarized border in the world, which is the border between Canada, which was British in those days, and the United States. Because we were fighting along that border. We were fighting on the Great Lakes. There were naval battles during the War of 1812. And for those that don't know about this war, Washington, D.C. was burned and the White House was burned.
Oops.
The president had to flee. We lost a battle in Washington. It was the last battle that an American president commanded the American forces, and it was James Madison was the president then during that war. But it led to this. And so there was a kind of, although Americans and British still didn't trust each other, the Americans trusted the British to make sure other powers didn't come in.
Yeah.
And of course, this actually happened when America was distracted during the Civil War. Napoleon III in France tried to put an Austrian on the as Emperor of Mexico, and tried to create Mexico as a colony of France. Do you remember this?
No, actually, I don't.
In the 18th. Yes, and of course, basically the U.S. military, when the Civil War was over, we had 1 million troops under arms, biggest army in the world, maybe the biggest army the world had ever seen, maybe since the Persian Empire. I don't know, a huge force. And we said,
Not happening.
you're not holding, France is not going to colonize Mexico. And of course, at that time, the British had contemplated going into the Civil War on the side of the South, the British and the French. But that did not happen. The British had a liberal government at the time. The British had already gotten rid of slavery in the British Empire. And of course, what happened was the Emancipation Proclamation. They were going to intervene, and of course, John Quincy Adams's son was the U.S. ambassador to Great Britain at the time. And he conveyed this Emancipation Proclamation. When the British government saw that Lincoln had freed the slaves everywhere the Union Army occupied, they could no longer declare war on the United States because they were so anti-slave. The war then became about not the Union, but about slavery.
Yeah.
And they could not then fight the Union. And so Britain said, all right, we'll
We have lost.
we'll build Confederate ships, but we will not intervene. And already Napoleon III had gotten ahead of himself in Mexico. But imagine if Lincoln hadn't done the Emancipation Proclamation, imagine the foreign powers. Britain would have enabled France, and both of them with their armies, to divide the United States, to divide and conquer it into North and South. That would have, of course, been to the advantage of the other great powers to have America divided. This is the same game that, by the way, the Russia and China is playing, and the KGB colonel that teaches at the diplomatic school in Moscow, Igor Panarin, has been on about for 30 years. Since in the last months of the Soviet Union, he was assigned this task of how do you divide and conquer America.
Oh boy! So yeah, people can tell what a sophisticated, complicated, game this is, and it's much more complex and intricate than what you see on the news or what you see on the internet and what influencers say. It's not like it's not really about the mood that Trump is in, or he suddenly wakes up and has some idea or whatnot, and it's a bigger system. It's the American system.
Well, I should mention, since we're talking about dividing America, America has been united with Canada in something called NORAD, the
American Aerospace Defense Command.
Yeah, the North American Aerospace Defense Command. I had the privilege of having dinner with the top commanders of NORAD who had just stepped down in August. I had dinner with them in September. Interesting conversation, very concerned, but something rather disturbing has happened that I have to mention that is not really being seriously discussed yet in the American media. By the time people see this, maybe it will be. But you remember that, and many of us thought it was funny at the time, that Trump had said to Prime Minister Trudeau, maybe you can be governor of Canada as a province, as a state in America. Talked about annexing Canada to the United States. Talked about, of course, bringing Greenland into the United States. It is possible it could happen because the United States could literally, there's a process for Greenland to get out of Denmark and to vote to become part of the U.S. And there's so few citizens in Denmark, they could all be bribed. They
and
could
it's
all
conservative.
Be made
people don't realize this. I mean,
yeah,
Denmark.
they could be bribed, but in the case of Canada, it's rather turned bad for Trump. Because now all the different political parties in Canada, all spectrum of opinion, have turned against Trump. And they've said that Trump is a threat to Canada and that we are uniting against Trump. In fact, the Premier of Ontario has called elections to strengthen his position against Trump. That's a conservative premier. So all of Canada is uniting against the United States, and there is this massive wave of anti-Americanism in Canada. And talk about leaving NORAD, talk about actually shifting over and becoming aligned with China, if you can believe that.
Yeah.
This is really alarming. And a lot of people, I know, a lot of American pundits say, well, this is just a phase, it's a passing thing. No, I think that Trump pinched them in the wrong place. And, alliances are made with words and they're broken with words, and not very many words can break an alliance. And if Canada goes with China, oh boy, do we have a problem.
Yeah.
if Chinese troops can be brought into the Western Hemisphere and put on Canada, then you will have an invasion of Canada by the United States preemptively to prevent China from basically getting a position from which it can invade the United States along
Yeah.
a border that's no longer militarized. I mean,
Yeah.
it's unimaginable what could
Yeah. So
happen here.
so is it really so astounding to people that let's say the NSA is looking around internationally who may harm American interests, who may align with the Chinese and the Russians. Who's sending money where, who is doing what where. There's a point. There's a point to this, and traditionally the intelligence community is fairly quiet. I mean, that's part of the job. But whenever there's
I would say they're not. It's not that they're quiet; they're risk averse because they
yeah.
were pretty loud 8 years ago saying Trump was a Russian puppet and there was interference in Trump's favor in the 2016 election. They were pretty loud, actually. But no, it's they're risk averse and they're left wing. They're far left of center. I think the intelligence
Yeah.
community, people who think the CIA is some kind of right wing imperialist organization.
No.
I don't
Yeah.
know. It never has been, and I don't understand. There was an anti-communist wing in the CIA, but I think that by the time you get to the Clinton administration, it's no longer the case. And it was. Look, you have former directors of the CIA saying that it was liberal in the 1960s. The CIA.
Yeah. I mean, we talked
That
about this.
most CIA officers were against the Vietnam War.
Yeah,
I
and
mean that's.
I talked about this one case on the show. This was very shortly before the Ukraine war, and there was this guy in big publication, and he wrote this piece, and he said, "I worked at the CIA for a couple of years, and I grew up with this patriotic bravado, and we're the good guys, but." And then he said he was disappointed with the CIA. He left. And it's just and then he found a new love for the Russians and the Soviet era, and he praised that book by a former high-ranking KGB official. I don't remember exactly who it was. And he found this new respect for the KGB and the Soviets, and he just figured out. He said that all that he's been taught was a lie. That we're not the good guys. The good guys are over there. Blah blah blah. And then he even praised the social advancements in the Soviet Union. And then he came to his final point, saying that even to this day, with Russia as it is now in the Putin era. He said that Russia is still not a threat. Even if they invade Ukraine, they're still not a threat. They're still not the bad guys. It's just that America has cultivated this, this militaristic sense of we have to do this, that, and the other. And so he preemptively made an excuse for the upcoming Ukraine war, and he said that I worked at the CIA, and I just didn't like it. I like the KGB better.
That kind of monster turns my stomach. That somebody could be so monstrous. Look,
but it's always these has-beens. It's always these washed up has-beens who suddenly find their new love for Putin's Russia.
Well, there's this monstrous notion that this is the basic formula. There's corruption in every country. All of us are human beings. And there's a kind of corruption where institutions, police, mayors, politicians, they will use their power sometimes to line their pockets. And especially when it comes to control over economic things like prohibition, like illegal drugs, things like that. It becomes easily corrupted through the police, through the mayors. Look, the best bottle of alcohol, the best bottle of Scotch whiskey in Chicago during Prohibition was in the mayor's office, right? Or in the mayor's home, mayor of Chicago. And it was the police that were standing by the beaches watching over Al Capone's gang to make sure nobody stopped them from offloading the boats from across the Great Lakes coming from Canada with the liquor from Ireland. The fact is, that all those policemen got that money to send their kids to private schools or to college. That was a corruption. It was corrupt. And it corrupted, and it was bad to be corrupt. The first seriously corrupted entity in the U.S. government was in the Treasury Department when they made cocaine and opiates illegal around, what was it, 1911, 1908? I can't remember now, but that just rotted right through really quickly. In fact, it became such a problem, they didn't know what to do with this group of people. And of course, this is what happens, and it happens in every government, all
and
governments.
People, and people get frustrated.
The money is too good, and what people go is they say, America is corrupt and evil. The Soviets and the Red Chinese have the truth, right? This is what they do because, by the way, they find out that unicorns don't exist, right? And America's not a utopia, and so they go to the other extreme, and now they're communists.
Yeah.
And the thing is that they don't understand. They're going from the frying pan into the fire. Do they understand that in our system, because a few things are illegal and the police are corrupt over managing those things, then in the Soviet Union, all economic activity is illegal. In China, all economic activity is legal. And the corruption is 100%.
There's
worse.
nothing else. There's nothing else there.
There's nothing else. It's
right?
massive corruption. It's evil on a scale. It's corruption and evil on a scale that you can't imagine. Yeah. And it is only liberty. It's only freedom and a system of freedom and checks and balances that gives you a decent society. Not a society free of corruption. Sorry. Yeah. There's no such thing as a society free of crime and corruption. No such thing. You're never going to get it.
There's a story from like a week ago or 2 weeks ago. This was in the New York Times, and the headline was China deploys more security to try to reassure a country on edge. What kind of stupid headline is that, by the way? China deploys more security to try to reassure a country on edge. I mean, there's so much wrong with one headline. There's like 5-6 things wrong with that headline to begin with. But you know, but if you read into it, it says here, there's new roundups and new crackdowns after a spate of mass killings has shaken the country and stirred fears about public safety. What kind of stupid description is that? Armed police have been stationed outside of schools with bollards erected nearby to prevent cars from ramming into people. Police officers have increased patrols in supermarkets, tourist attractions, and other crowded places, and pledged to better regulate knives and other weapons. So basically what that means is, and they call this Operation Winter, they will go into karaoke bars where people have a few drinks and they sing stupid songs and they don't even hit the notes. They put security forces into the karaoke bars because somebody may actually say something against the government, after a few drinks. This is not reassuring a country that's on edge, that's trying to crack down in a complete tyranny because the government is so afraid that something an actual change might take place, right? So this is not like there's evil right-wing networks in China trying to do an uprising. These are just people, right? These are just the citizens over there. And so on the American side, there had to be preparations. There had to be a tool set in America, and for example, this MainCore database, when this became public in 2008 in the press, the journalists said that MainCore may be tied to a continuity of government program created by the Reagan administration to keep the U.S. government functioning in the event of a nuclear attack. Well, that's important, right? Under a 1982 presidential directive, the outbreak of war could trigger the proclamation of martial law nationwide, giving the military the authority to use its domestic database to round up citizens and illegals, people considered to be threats to national security. The emergency measures for domestic security were to be carried out by the Federal Emergency Management Agency, FEMA, and the Army. In the late 1980s, reports about a domestic database linked to FEMA and the continuity of government program began to appear in the press. In 1986, the Austin American Statesman uncovered evidence of a large database that authorities were proposing to use to intern Latino dissidents, that basically means terrorists, and communist refugees during a national emergency that might follow a potential U.S. invasion of Nicaragua. And then, of course, in 87, the Iran-Contra congressional hearings, Reagan aide Oliver North was questions about this, questioned by the committee chairman, Democratic Senator Daniel Inouye, and the answers were refused because of the highly sensitive and classified nature of FEMA's domestic security operations. Latino uprisings, communist refugees, and then it says, or then here about this Rex 84 exercise, or Rex 84B, Readiness Exercise 1984 Bravo. That was a classified scenario and drill developed by the United States federal government to detain large numbers of people deemed to be national security threats in the event that the president declared a national emergency. This scenario envisioned state defense forces rounding up 500,000 undocumented Central American people and 4,000 American citizens whom the U.S. Attorney General had designated as national security threats. So 4,000 domestic commies and a bunch of communist refugees, basically. That's what they were planning for. It's not like rounding up Joe Schmo from Idaho or bringing in the New World Order.
Well, especially when you had communist nuclear weapons pointed at the United States. I mean, in the 1980s, Russia almost nuked the United States in 1983. So the threat of nuclear war was very real. And if you have a nuclear war and you have 500,000 people who are under communist control in the United States and 4,000 organizers of this, communist organizers, you're going to have to do something because they could commit terrorist acts, sabotage. They could break water systems. They could take down power plants. So obviously the United States, but of course today, because of the atmosphere created since Joseph McCarthy, since they've ostracized anybody who's anti-communist, you have a right to be an enemy of the United States, a domestic enemy, and to have full freedom to do whatever damage or sabotage or propaganda that you want to do in time of war.
Yeah.
So the government's not allowed. In fact, the people that the Homeland Security has made lists of are returning veterans who are patriots, who are right of center. So that it's more likely that my name as an American anti-communist who wants America protected against Russia and China, it's more likely that my name is on a list of people to be arrested.
Yes.
That it is an actual communist is to be on a list of people arrested.
Yeah, and we know that the Soviets.
Sorry, that's the way it is.
Yeah, we know that the Soviets, they also had databases of foreign nations or about foreign nations that they wanted to invade, and so in case of an invasion, especially in Europe, the communist forces or the Red Army, they would already have these detailed, updated lists of whom to arrest or eliminate outright. Now, for example, this was when I think there was one of these lists that was stolen from the Stasi archive in East Germany, right? So there was one brave soul that took these lists out of a safe and smuggled them out and smuggled himself out. And then Western intelligence learned that these lists with the Stasi, they were updated every week. So in case they rolled over Western Germany, which they were prepared to do, the East German forces, the Volksarmee, the People's Army, this was an invasion force. They had these strategic command bunkers built along the German border, and they were equipped with computers to facilitate this large attack. And they had these lists ready to round people up, specific selected people like you, people like me, whatever. They would arrest them or eliminate them immediately. Others were probably designated for re-education camps in case they were able to actually build them in time, these facilities. They have lists too. it's not just oh, the evil Reagan government. They had lists of domestic enemies. Other countries have these lists too. And there was even a special list drawn up, and this was so secret it took until a few years ago till we figured that one out. There was a special force with the Stasi and the East German Army. It was called something like AGMS. This was for special purposes, and this was around 3,500 people. Super training, modeled after the British SOE and some other stuff. And these were half soldiers, half agents, or intelligence officers, and they were able to silently cross the border even before a war starts. And they had detailed lists of whom to eliminate before the Red Army comes or before the Soviet forces arrive. So you would have seen a string of assassinations, people getting killed in their beds, specific people with major corporations, government, security, you name it. These people would have been murdered in their beds even before the other steps would actually happen. And just it's a fascinating topic. Now on the American side, eventually this database needed a software to search it or to better prioritize it, and this ultimately became a piece of software called Promise. Now this was from Inslaw Incorporated, a Washington D.C. based IT company that marketed case management software for corporate and government users. So then Promise apparently was used for this MainCore database, and then the case becomes really woozy and very mysterious because some shady characters, they try to be part of Promise, or they try to add things to Promise, maybe backdoors into Promise. And there's also a tie to the character of Robert Maxwell with his daughter Ghislaine Maxwell, who was getting the young girls for Jeffrey Epstein, the supposedly dead pedophile.
Yeah, and by the way, just before Maxwell died, falling off his yacht, he was setting up Soviet front companies in the last months of the Soviet Union all throughout the United States. He was a Soviet, people say he's an Israeli agent. Whatever he did for Israel, he was primarily
Yeah.
an instrument of the KGB and part of its infiltration. And somehow I suspect he had a falling out with them. And that's why he died. But his daughter, I think, continued to carry forward.
Yeah.
And I think that's what the Jeffrey Epstein pedophile ring is about. I think it's
Yeah.
ultimately
There was
a
a.
Soviet operation that's continued on past the Soviet period.
I'm trying to remember the book title that was very interesting because of all the Russian connections with Epstein and his people. I think, was it American Compromat? I don't remember exactly which one it was. And
There's been a number of them, and there's been some good research done, but no, none of these people are capable of connecting the dots
yeah,
correctly to the Soviet bloc and its
yeah.
intelligence
And there
operations.
was this other guy that Epstein was sort of connected to. This was a French individual, and he was also in the fashion industry, getting the young models to Paris and then just exploiting them and shipping them to elite customers and whatnot. And there was so many Russian connections, but that never made many headlines. And the truthers, they didn't touch that aspect, that angle with a 10-foot pole. It was always just
No, they don't. They have to always notice the narrative is always the CIA's behind everything. The KGB and the Russians
yeah,
do nothing. They're like their hands are clean. They don't do anything, and it's really quite the opposite. And not that the CIA is clean, but that the KGB and the Chinese services, they're 90%. And the parts of the CIA and MI5 or MI6 that are involved in this stuff are the parts that are infiltrated by the KGB and or the Chinese or sister services. So it's and this is true when you go to Iran-Contra and you read something like Compromise, Bush, Clinton, and the CIA, which was Terry Reid's book. Terry Reid ran the CIA proprietary company in Mexico that was moving the arms to the Contras, and that found his warehouse was full of cocaine,
Hmm.
and that made the allegation in his book that Felix Rodriguez was a longtime KGB agent, and that he was they were moving drugs through the counter resupply operation to compromise all the CIA people, and they murdered, according to Terry Reid, they murdered all the CIA people in Air America that would not go along with this. They just
Yeah.
murdered them. And so this is a very, I mean, Terry Reid's book, Compromised. I mean, Terry Reid is literally keeping a low profile now because he's afraid they're still going to come after him and kill him. But it's the communists that are behind it, the communist bloc, the communist networks, the communist secret police of both Russia and China, and their drug cartels, their guerrillas in South America that are raising cocaine, like those in Colombia, like the FARC, huge cocaine growing areas the size of Switzerland out in the wilds, and of course it goes back and forth, and it's just all a battle to take over the world.
Yeah. And
That's it.
this the and so if you have tools like MainCore, if you have software like Promise, right, and there's a breach, there's a mole, there's a big traitor, then it becomes a huge issue because how
The
good is
Russians
this?
have it. The
Yeah,
Chinese have it. Then
yeah. So how good is
your
this
enemies.
American? How good is this American tool set when there's nothing remains secret anymore from the Russians and the Chinese? They know
Well,
what
after
asset.
Edward Snowden,
Yeah, they know what
right?
asset
After
on the
Edward
ground.
Snowden, yeah.
They know what asset on the
How is
ground is
anything?
compromised
Yeah.
or is in danger of being
I
unmasked.
mean,
So
Edward Snowden gave them the whole NSA in what 2011, right?
13,
And
11, I
and of
don't
course,
remember.
I would recommend Edward J. Epstein's book on Snowden. It's excellent. In fact, when you get done reading the book, you realize Snowden had been almost certainly was spying for the Russians all along, and that he created this phony, idealistic alibi to make himself look like, well, I'm a whistleblower. No, you're not. You've just been a
Yeah.
spy for Russia.
Oh,
He gave
he
everything
wanted
to
to
Russia.
join. He
Now you're
wanted to join
living there.
this. Yeah, he wanted to join the special forces at some point, even though he was
Oh,
completely
yeah.
not capable of doing so. He had this unrealistic view of himself. He was not quite capable of distinguishing fantasy from reality, and he skipped school. I think he didn't even finish school of some sort, or had he tried to avoid school by saying, "I'm so sick, I can't do this. I'm so miserable. Please let me play my video games." And then he wanted to become a super soldier. It's just the whole guy is just one of those typical examples. But if you
Well,
have
the HBO movie about him, the HBO movie about him
terrible,
is
terrible. And
garbage.
if you
Just
have
garbage.
created a tool set and to against these uprisings, and if this tool set is compromised, this opens up new possibilities for the Russians and the Chinese. They may decide to keep the American intelligence community busy by giving them a few throwing them a few cases of people that can be prosecuted. So let's say Russia is running someone or China is running someone in the U.S. and the communists then give this asset training and coaching, which is deliberately poor, so that this guy then gets investigated, and the American intelligence community is basically wasting its time on that guy, while the really important guys are somewhere else. And here's an angle to this. It says here the success of the Promise software eventually caught the attention of Rafi Eitan, the notorious and legendary Israeli spy master and handler of the most damaging spy in American history. Well, that's debatable. Jonathan Pollard.
Yeah, that
Eitan,
is debatable.
yeah, Eitan at the time was serving as the then head of the now defunct Israel intelligence service known as Lechem, which focused specifically on espionage related to scientific and technical information and discoveries. So Eitan first learned of Promise from Earl Bryan. Bryan was a longtime associate of Ronald Reagan, who had previously worked for the CIA in covert operations and had been in charge of Reagan's healthcare program when Reagan was governor of California. Now, according to the testimony of ex-Mossad official Ari Ben Menashe, after a copy of Promise was obtained by Israeli military intelligence, Ben Menashe contacted an Israeli-American programmer living in California on Eitan's orders. The programmer then planted a trapdoor or backdoor into the software that will allow LACAM covert access to any database connected to a device on which the software was installed. Now, of course, when the truthers got wind of that, and they always just read regular news stories, right? And then they add their own interpretation to it. When the truthers got wind of it, they immediately framed it the way they always frame it. They say, well, it's the elders of Zion, and they run everything. Everything bad in America goes back to these elders of Zion. And some authors out there, they painted the whole Epstein Maxwell scandal. They painted this as a giant elders of Zion operation to compromise Americans and all that. But if we look at the facts now, of course, let's say the Mossad, which is the most widely known, I guess, Israeli intelligence service, the Mossad is very, very capable. But there's a huge problem that was already always built into Israel since its inception, and that was this KGB infiltration, that was communist infiltration of Israel. Now, if that's already in place when Israel began, that creates a whole new ballpark of problems, especially for the United States and other countries that may have been countries like Germany, for example, that was the target of Israeli espionage. So if the Mossad can gather intelligence, the Russians may have it. That's something that people should be aware of. And there's so many individuals running around, and in the press they're called Jewish oligarchs, but they're really Russian, or you don't really know what they are, because for a long time Jews in the Soviet Union were treated like garbage and infiltrated. We know the KGB always knew everything about Jews in the Soviet Union, all the underground schools, all the Jewish culture. Even though Jews tried to shield themselves and were pretty capable, but we know this from testimony from people who were part of this group. What was it called? The Chabad group, which became a thing on the internet because people think it's the Elders of Zion, which is nonsense. But people from Chabad, they try to preserve Jewish life in places, for example, like the Soviet Union. But these Chabad people, they said, well, the KGB always knew everything about us, and they had sources everywhere, and they knew everything. So this is an issue. This is an issue when you have a tool set, and through one way or the other, the Russians know about it, and they can tell their own assets in America and Europe, okay, you gotta watch out because the FBI is after you, or the NSA has a new tool, so you have to change your method of communication with Moscow, for example.
Well, this is why the war of the moles, if you get your moles inside someone else's, at the top levels of someone else's intelligence service, essentially their intelligence service is working for you. So if the KGB or the GRU gets people inside Mossad, gets people inside the CIA, the NSA, suddenly that information comes flowing to them. Then they are the masters. And of course, I saw there was an interview on one of the major podcasters of a leading intelligence historian. He said, well, who's had the best intelligence service over the last century? He says, well, the Russians. They've been the kings of intelligence. I mean, and I was very gratified to hear that, because it's quite obvious when you go over the history and you go over it. But this discussion, we're running out of time, and we have to discuss Trump's meeting with Putin and the peace talks about Ukraine.
Upcoming planned meeting, right? This hasn't happened yet.
No, it hasn't happened. They're planning it for March, I think, is when they're planning the meeting. But I got some intelligence. And I wanted to mention that the word is from different sources that the war in Ukraine is going to end within 120 days, maybe within 90 days. And I'm going to tell you what the Russian negotiating position is versus what they were claiming last June, but it's very similar. And see what you think of this, because you probably haven't heard this. And I was told this by a Russian source. This is what they're working on right now, and I'm afraid the Trump administration will take a version of this deal. So let's see how this works. Number one, Ukraine will never enter NATO. Number two, Crimea remains Russian territory. Number three, Donbass becomes an independent state under basic Russian occupation, and it votes in the Ukrainian elections. The votes from there contribute to who runs Kiev. And
The exile.
it's unclear. It's unclear when the Russian forces leave.
And there was an exile,
These
an exile mentioned, because I shared your latest piece from your
yes,
blog.
yeah.
They want
Is
the Zelensky government to send it to an exile.
the entire government has to go into exile, so they can't participate in any more politics anymore. Then there's elections called, and it seems the Russians want their troops to stay in all the occupied areas, which means they would control the elections in all the other provinces they control outside of Donbass, or partial control. And that the election is going to be held on the basis of none of the people fighting Russia are going to be allowed in politics to oppose the election. And the Russians are going to be able to just generate votes in the occupied areas to determine what the new government's going to be. And of course, all sanctions lifted on Russia so that Russia can reinvigorate its economy and its military, get credits, get technology, and so on. And that is what the Russians are going to be angling for. But the key point, and I get it from Eric Prince, the mercenary, the guy that owns a big mercenary company.
Yeah. Connected family,
Yeah, and because Prince is an advisor to Russia, and Prince is connected to people I know. And what he said to Breitbart a week ago, 2 days before the inauguration, a week ago today, we're broadcasting on Saturday. He said that we need to make Russia our buddy, because Russia is now is subservient. He uses the term subservient to China, and that's a disaster for us. So we have to make as if Russia would then be subservient to us if we were somehow gave them Ukraine. And this is very disturbing. It's not like, well, Ukraine and the United States share the same values. We share the same enemy. We should be supporting Ukraine because Ukraine stops the Russians in their aggression cold, and that stops the Chinese because the Chinese need the Russians to win in Ukraine so they can unite with the Russians in the Pacific and over the Arctic and in Asia. None of this is taken into account. It's just we're going to win over Russia. And the problem is the Russians lie. Oh, yeah, we'll be your friend. We won't be under China. Ha ha, we're going to help China defeat the United States. And the stupid Americans aren't going to do anything because they think they've got the Russian military on their side. That's the game. And I got to be honest, I give it a better than 50-50 that the Trump administration will fall for this. I hope not. I dearly hope not. But if they do, the United States is going to be devastated. And there's no stopping the war.
I see some very mixed signals. For one, I mean, there was a piece published recently by the Council on Foreign Relations, in which I don't remember who it was. I think I posted it on candorintel.com, where these authors, they made the exact opposite point. They said that it's pointless to try to separate Russia, to try to separate Russia from China. This whole
it's
Kissinger.
Not, it's more than pointless. Yeah. It's dangerous.
Yeah. So they said it's not doable. It's stupid. It's stupid to try. We're way past that point. And this was kind of a watershed moment, I think, for the CFR, because for a long time they followed this nonsense approach, or intentionally bad approach, by Henry Kissinger, and we talked about Kissinger at length when he died.
Yes.
So for a long time, the CFR and others, they kind of tried the the Kissinger approach and the Kissinger argument. We can do this, pull this system off where everybody remains peaceful, and we have to give in to demands by the Russians and the Chinese, and hopefully this will all be balanced out. But now the CFR, these CFR people have outright said, this is over, this is done, this is over. There's no trying is moot, it's futile, it's nonsense, and it's stupid. And in April of 2024, the now special envoy for the Trump administration, former General Kellogg, he put out this piece where he laid out his idea of a deal with the Russians, and his idea was far different and very, very harsh. It talked about temporarily ceding Ukrainian territory, but getting it back eventually at a later stage when there's no more Putin and all that. And so there's, again, it's mixed signals now with the incoming or now Trump administration, and the speech that was given by Trump. He also sounded pretty. He also just, called for ushering in a new era of American sovereignty and no more nonsense, and creating an even bigger military, more capable military, and not playing these stupid games anymore. But It may be about buying time. I don't really think that, or it may be that Mr. Prince is not really believing what he says. He may just have.
No, I think he does. I think he does believe what he says.
I mean, I don't really trust Prince that much, but I think some others, I think they're quite capable of saying something that they don't necessarily believe in, but they think it's necessary to say it at that point in time, maybe to play for more time.
There's a lot of confusion right now in these policymaking circles. They're sorting it out, and there are some people who are thinking clearly, and there's some people like Eric Prince. I mean, do you realize that in Eric Prince's Breitbart interview a week ago, he said that Russia's economy is fine. It's America's economy that's in trouble, and that's why we need to make peace in Ukraine, because it's going to damage our economy. This is what he said. This is so inverted. Oh, absolute baloney. That's nonsense. The Russians are extremely damaging. I mean, right now, the United States has a position, if it's used correctly, to put Russia in a box economically, to strip Russia of its ability to threaten us, and to also keep China on a leash. If we do it right, and to ultimately cause changes, genuine changes in Russia and China, because the economic conditions are so bad. I mean, we literally have given oxygen to China to make China big. We've given money.
Temporarily.
We literally have done this. Somebody's trying to call me, and I'm broadcasting on my phone because I can't connect on my laptops, but on my desktop. But they literally there is this problem, and the thing is that we are the masters, we in the West, of economics.
Yeah.
We are the masters of flexible politics, of freedom is stronger than autocracy. I mean, Machiavelli said it in the Discourses on Livy. He said, man, a republic, you can't stop a republic once it gets going.
Yeah,
but America is very maneuverable, very able to maneuver, but it can't. In the end, if a republic is mobilized, it can't fight a republic. Look at how Ukraine has stopped the Russian autocracy.
Yeah, it's like America has proven in the real world, not in theory, not in an argument. America has proven again and again that it can do both. It can pull these different things off at the same time, have a super military and a great economy, just outspending, out innovating the Soviets or the Nazis, and just thrive. They've proven it again and again. It worked before. We remember the Cold War. So and today, I mean, Russia Russia's economy is not just in massive, massive trouble. It's tiny, and everyone knows it. It's really, really tiny.
It's the
And
size of Holland's. It's the size of the Dutch economy in terms of
yeah,
its. But you see, this is not. These measurements are not really correct because Russia is an enormous country with enormous resources, and you can't because it is a semi-feudal, semi. It's a mercantilist economy under an autocracy, under what is essentially a one-party state or an administrative state. That there is no real democracy. There's no real pluralism. Rather, it is different power centers in a kind of feudal arrangement of fealty, doing their part, and of course, ripping off the Russian people, just completely correct. It's a kleptocracy,
hardcore,
which
hardcore.
is what these things evolve into. And the same thing is in China. And the thing is that it is a extremely it's a pathological form of state, of economy, of government. And it's pathological in the sense that it can unleash a nuclear world war because it has these really sick motivations, conquest. Literally the people, the psychopaths that run it enjoy victimizing people. They get their jollies from being able to rob people and murder them. And that's how the system, and they lust for power and more power. And so something like the West, which is pluralistic and there's many different power centers and it's very complicated and there's checks and balances, they hate that because that could bring them down. That starts
Yeah,
to be applied to them and they're gone because they're weak, because they operate by hurting people and people turn against them. People want to kill
yeah.
them,
And
right?
ultimately,
And want to destroy them. And they know it. And so they need to continually lie and trick people and try to destroy.
yeah.
They're the only
And
way to survive.
people, I mean, people like Eric Prince and the crowd that he's a part of or he's associating with. Now, we've seen things that they tried in the past, and now with let's say Elon Musk having joined the debate. I mean, he's made some statements about Russia, which I really don't like at all. I mean, we've seen this kind of stuff before. I mean, remember Nelson Bunker Hunt financing, what was it, the John Birch Society, I think it was, and some other things. Then it was, I mean, he was an oil and like a very rich person in the oil, from the oil business, Nelson Bunker Hunt. And we had Koch Industries. Initially, the old Koch,
the Koch brothers.
yeah, the
Yeah.
old Mr. Koch, he sold these oil processing facilities to the Soviet Union, and then suddenly the Koch family decided, no, we're anti-communists now. And then the next generation, the infamous Koch brothers, they also put money into the John Birch Society and
Yes, they did.
and these things, and eventually,
And libertarian groups.
yeah, and eventually these things that were created, like the Birch Society, they took on a life of their own. And you mentioned this before, this strange the strange message from the Birch Society, which at times controlled or had almost or had a huge grip on conspiracy media. The Birchers, some of them started to sound like the left at some point, just demonizing all the industry in America. And it sounded almost like when you dig deeper and you see the traces of even older conspiracy media in the Birch Society literature, like was it Gary Allen's book and others, or the old Skousen
None dare
book.
call it conspiracy. Yes.
Yeah, and the old Skousen, who had a book out, I think it was called The Naked Capitalist or some sort.
And the Naked Communist. Yeah, I wrote both
and
books.
so when you read these books, there's stuff in it like the Rothschild mythology, which is basically completely false. And it's all in there. And so it created this dynamic, and eventually, I mean, we know that the Russians, they tried to infiltrate the Russians tried to control as much of the conspiracy movement as they could, and eventually, I mean, isn't it like at some point, people like Eric Prince and others, it's this feedback loop. They finance Birchers and they finance some other media like that. It takes on a life of its own, and then this feeds back into these politicians and some of these other guys, and eventually they have a hard time figuring out, who's a friend and who's an enemy, because it takes up people's time. They get in contact with this content again and again and again, and it's a generational thing. I mean, there was some old schoolers, who've been around when the Birch Society was so dominant in conspiracy media, and then they have all the books on the bookshelves, and then their own kids or the next generation starts to read this stuff and newer stuff. And they agree. These younger people agree with the older people. Yeah, the conspiracy is like this and it's like that, and it just draws people attention away from decent books, decent programs, real talk. And I mean, how much do you think Eric Prince and some others? How much do you think these people are influenced by contemporary influencers out there?
Oh, look, I know things I can't talk about. I know who's influencing who. I know where things are coming from. It's just too sensitive to talk about, because I'm standing just outside the circle, watching and interacting with people on the outside of the circle, seeing how it works. And I've really been involved in this investigation since early 2021, when people tried to draw me into the Dennis Montgomery false narrative about election fraud in 2020. I I learned a lot about how things work and how really compromised and infiltrated the right is. And of course, I knew the left because I was at graduate school and saw how liberals and leftists were being manipulated. But on the right, it's going on, and I can name names, but I can't, not publicly, because I don't have legal
But just
protection.
in a general sense, could you give us a rough idea? Just how easy is it to influence somebody? Is it because sometimes it's a tailored narrative, or it's made so specific people find it more alluring? I mean, is it hard to do?
It's a feedback loop. I mean, they float ideas and they don't initially get picked up, and then they just keep sort of massaging the idea, changing it a little bit, and figuring out what they can add to it to make it digestible for certain people. And the thing that makes a lot of people involved in politics and playing the game, what makes them vulnerable, what really makes them vulnerable, is that they don't read enough. They haven't thought deeply enough, so their views can be changed rather easily because their understandings are superficial, their knowledge is more or less superficial, and so it's easy to move them. And then if anybody is strong-minded, has really thought it through, or has really strong knowledge, they end up getting ostracized. They end up getting attacked, so that they're taken out of the equation. And I've seen social media, right-wing social media, destroy individuals who
Yeah.
then
Oh
just sort
yeah.
of, they meekly, I know three, two are good friends of mine. Another one is a American counterintelligence official who I have tremendous respect for. He's a man of incredible integrity, who they destroyed him, and he just disappeared. He's just gone. He's off the radar. He's basically not going to be involved in anything anymore. His wisdom, his knowledge is just lost. His inputs are lost. And the other people just were destroyed. Their reputations were destroyed. Nobody is going to listen to them. They have no influence. They're just gone. And the thing is that once you start to have a positive effect on that circle of opinion, and you are not one of the agents of influence. The agents of influence receive an order saying, this person is a problem.
Yeah.
We need to ostracize them and get them out of the way because they're threatening our operation, our active measure. And this is on a level of people talking to each other on an elite level, one-on-one, or in groups or in meetings. That's how detailed it is. Not just media, not just in whatever. It's one-to-one. This person met with President Trump for the first time and starting to have an influence on him. Destroy his reputation. Eliminate him immediately.
Yeah,
It's real.
we talked about in a previous episode about a new modern day trust style operation by the Russians, where they have not just the broad narratives for the masses in the West, the usual stuff, but they have a special version, a special program for higher ranking targets in the West. And I did some digging, and it seems like the story goes, well, the false story, of course, goes that there was this underground movement in Soviet Russia, especially in the later stages, and this Christian conservative underground movement over there with people like Anatoly Sobchak and Putin. This underground network brought down the Soviet Union, or played an integral part in bringing down the Soviet Union. And so,
It's complete nonsense.
yeah, and so
These
it's like,
people are all KGB
yeah,
agents or officers.
yeah, but it sounds alluring. I mean, it sounds exactly what some people would like to hear. And I think that when I hear General Flynn talking to Alex Jones, and then Alex Jones says this, that, and the other, like a watered down version of what Flynn was told.
Both of these men should have, sweaty socks stuffed in their mouth and be forced to wear a dunce cap and sit in the corner. This is an ideal. It's not going to happen. But
Yeah, but they probably believe they have some elite information
Oh yeah.
that was
Oh well.
brought to them.
Or they with people like that, the word believe is too convenient. These people don't have beliefs. They have narratives that are convenient, that make them popular, that they then believe because it's convenient to believe it.
Oh boy.
They have no integrity. General Flynn has no integrity. Alex Jones has no integrity. Sorry.
Yeah.
I've watched them for years. They have no integrity. And they're both half-educated. They're compromised. And that is, I say, when you go so far down a road of a false narrative, that compromises you.
Yeah.
You can.
And
There's
also,
no way. I doubt there's any way to climb back from it.
yeah, and also these narratives that are being spun, they always get morphed to the next stage. It's not like it's a stationary narrative, stationary thing, because when Eric Prince is now bringing up this old argument that was even around during the George W. Bush era. We have to pull the Russians over to our side so the Russians don't join with the Chinese. That's an old idea that was floated around in the 2000s. But when you try that now, the same idea, I mean, it's even morphed beyond that, because there's with the German extreme right wing, the AfD party, they have opened up to communist China. The prime candidate of the AfD party, Mrs. Alles or Miss Alice Weidel, and others, significant people in the party that have great influence. These people love China. They've been to China. There's something, I think, even speak Chinese. One guy had his assistant, or one guy had an assistant. I think it was Mr. Kra. His assistant got arrested on suspicion of spying for the Chinese, and it goes on and on. So now it's even morphed beyond, let's pull the Russians to our side. Now it's, well, the Chinese are also the good ones, and the big enemy is these globalists in America. So if we bring them down, everything will be awesome. Right? I mean, where does this end? I mean, we talked about this. We heard Alex Jones trying this thing before, like a trial balloon. His guy Owen Schroyer tried it. I think claiming that maybe, or insinuating that maybe the Chinese at the top are not communists anymore. Maybe Xi Jinping's really
Oh, good grief. Not that
working behind the
again. Yeah.
scenes to end communism. I mean, it's basically a trust operation. It's a massive long-term deception,
Mm.
and sometimes it takes 10
No.
years for a deception. Sometimes it takes 20 or
They
30
they
years.
they have so many trusts going on now. They have so many different versions. So different. And by the way, it's like Baskin Robbins ice cream here in the U.S. There's 31 flavors they call it. There's 31 flavors of the trust now. So if someone doesn't buy one, there's another one. They'll get the chocolate rather than the vanilla or the strawberry or the orange sherbet maroon chocolate, whatever. They're going to do it. They're going to get a flavor that somebody goes for. And that's the thing they realize is that people have weaknesses for different flavors. Just keep making flavors until they buy it. But Alex, we've got to the end of our time, so I have to go, and I want to thank the audience for joining us here at the end of Inauguration Week. 47th President Donald J. Trump is now in the White House. It's hard to believe. It's just amazing. And of course, there's more fun and madness to come. I am Jeff Nyquist. Alex Benesch has been my co-host. This has been Friends and Enemies, where we draw the distinction between friends and enemies. And thanks for joining us. Until next week.